Friends, I welcome you to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It is not difficult for you, but it is pleasant for me. And we're starting. I met Jane while serving on the USNS Comfort, one of the Navy's Mercy-class hospital ships, immediately after the 2010 Haiti earthquake. The Comfort ship was in the Caribbean, providing assistance to the victims. I was a second lieutenant. There were 2 months left before the end of my 6-year service period, and I was ready to receive an honorable discharge and return to the civilian world. Everything worked out as well as possible. The time spent as an officer commanding a team of assistant machinists gave me ample opportunities for a decent civilian career. Jane was a recent college graduate with a nursing degree, a civilian volunteer on the ship helping with recovery after operations. We met when my team was troubleshooting her room. I immediately admired her beauty. Height 5'8", 172.7 centimeters, slim athletic build. She played women's soccer at school and college. Long blonde hair, blue eyes, and the most beautiful smile I have seen in recent years. I tried to start a conversation with her without seeming intrusive and without interfering with her performance of her duties. There are strict rules on the ship regarding the fraternization policy, but over the next few weeks, we had the opportunity to have lunch together several times. I've spent enough time with Jane to want to get to know her better. She probably felt the same way, because she gave me her parents' address and her mobile phone number. We agreed to meet after my demobilization. A week after I retired, I knocked on the door of her parents' house in a Philadelphia suburb. Jane's parents, Paul and Rose, greeted me with friendly smiles. The 4 of us cooked a delicious homemade dinner. Rose is an excellent cook. Paul is an Air Force veteran who served in the 60s. We dropped the interspecies rivalry and immediately became friends. Paul even gave me a tip to work in Philly. The tip turned into an offer that turned into a career. I must admit that my relationship with Jane developed much more slowly than I would have liked. Rose and Paul were old-school Catholics, and since Jane lived at home, the possibilities for realizing our growing love for each other were limited. Jane wasn't a virgin. She had 2 steady boyfriends in college. It took 4 months before Jane and I finally ended up in my bed. It was pretty vanilla, but wonderful. Jane's previous boyfriends, apparently, were not very imaginative in bed. She was shocked by some of the things we did that first weekend, although, as I said, everything was pretty vanilla. Jane and I got married 10 months after I moved to Pennsylvania. We both had great jobs, and we decided that we would wait a few years before starting a family. We used these years to accumulate good capital for a new home and give Jane the opportunity to become a full-time mom when our children arrive. We also used these years to enjoy each other's company, emotionally. We spent our honeymoon on the Caribbean island of St. Martin. I managed to rent a 35-foot, 10.7 m sailing yacht in Marigot, the capital of French St. Martin. We went around the island and went to Anguilla and St. Barth. Jane surprised me by the fact that she spent most of her time between harbors sunbathing on the deck of the yacht. It's kind of stupid to put on clothes when no one sees us, isn't it? The 3rd night on the yacht was probably the most magical in my life. Jane and I finished the delicious red snapper dish, which was accompanied by a wonderful bottle of Burgundy Chardonnay. We spread a blanket on the deck and stared at a million stars. 2 shooting stars streaked across the sky. We made love, and when we were done, we fell asleep in each other's arms, the only ones in the world that night. 2 days later, we sailed into the bay at Orient Bay. We reached the shore, and Jane was stunned to find that we were on the nudist beach of Orient Bay. Rick, everyone is naked here. Jane was wearing the smallest bikini, and she was still too dressed. I decided to shock Jane and took off my swimming trunks. Rick, what are you doing? When in Rome, the expression, when in Rome, do as the Romans. When in Rome, do as the Romans. Well, not me. We were walking along the beach along the naturist resort, Jane in a bikini, me in my birth costume. By the time we returned to the resort's restaurant, Papagayo, Jane had given up the top, but remained in her underpants. It was a unique experience. I swam to the boat and took our towels, suntan cream, and money. We took 2 sun loungers on the beach and a bucket of beer. Jane didn't take off her panties. Some parts of the body are only for my husband's eyes. That was her only comment about it. It was a beautiful day. After a couple of hours, we swam back to the boat and vowed to return someday. A day spent in the sun, when people looked at my beautiful wife topless, boosted my libido. Jane and I spent the evening on a yacht making love. We anchored at the pier on Pinal Island, after which we sailed back to Marigot and flew home. In the 6 years since our honeymoon before Hurricane Irma, Jane and I have returned to the island 9 times. We either rented a sailing yacht or stayed in a condominium on Orient Beach, but never visited a naturist resort, although, from time to time, we sunbathed on Club Orient Beach. Jane never changed her mind about total nudity, but the bottom of her bikini was significantly reduced, sometimes to the size of a thong, while the treasures remained hidden. We had already booked our 10th visit when the trouble happened. The photos of the destruction that we found on the internet reminded us of what we saw after the disaster in Haiti. Words cannot describe the destruction. A month after Irma, Jane was working in one of the clinics in the city when she learned about the opportunity to help rebuild a clinic in the vicinity of Marigot, in the same non-profit charity organization in which she worked as a volunteer in Haiti. Jane almost attacked me when I walked through the front door of our apartment. "Rick, can you believe this? They need help on St. Martin. They are asking for qualified medical professionals to launch a new clinic in Marigot. I've already talked to my boss. He said he would approve my vacation." "Wait a minute, Jane. For how long is this calculated?" "From 3 to 5 months. And you didn't think we should talk about this first?" "Of course you do. It just didn't occur to me that you wouldn't approve. I didn't sign anything, and I didn't make any commitments. I'm sorry if I was a little hasty. I was just so excited when I received the letter today." "What about our plans to start a family? You stopped taking the pills last month. Can we postpone this for a few months?" "Just for a few months, I promise. We'll be careful until I get back, and until then we'll use condoms. Please?" It took more than an hour before I finally agreed with Jane. It was more important than both of us. The people we knew and loved needed her help. I took a few days off to accompany Jane to St. Martin's and help her settle into her new place. We landed on the island on Thursday and rented a car. Although we rented a room for the weekend, our first stop was at the charity's office, the second at the apartment where Jane will live. We met Jane's neighbor, Allison Parker. We invited her to dinner, and the more I talked to Allison, the more I liked her. She seemed responsible, happily married, in her early 30s. By the time we dropped Allison off at the apartment and headed to Orient Bay to check into our room, my anxiety level had halved. On Friday morning, Jane and I went to the beach to go for a run. As we were running along the beach, a man was running towards us. We exchanged smiles and small waves, nothing unusual, just the politeness that fitness enthusiasts exchange. Jane and I ran to the end of the bay and turned back. Halfway there, we approached the same runner. This time he stopped. "Bonjour, good afternoon." To my surprise, Jane stopped. "Bonjour." The man held out his hand to me. "Are you Americans?" I returned his handshake. "How did you guess?" "Just a wild guess. The clothes, the friendliness when I greeted you, the accent." "My name is Jean-Paul." "I'm Richard. This is my wife, Jane." Jean-Paul held out his hand to her. "It's a pleasure. It's nice to meet new people. After Irma, the beach has become so deserted, especially at this time of year." Jean-Paul stared at Jane for too long, but it was hard to blame him, as she looked spectacular in her bra and running shorts. When Jean-Paul asked how we planned to spend the day, I was annoyed that Jane informed us of our intention to visit a nudist beach. Of course, he showed up on the same day. He moved the chaise longue to the other side of Jane from me. He made sure she was watching when he pulled down his pants. He organized a special exhibition, smearing himself with sunscreen, especially there. For the next hour, he told us the story of his life, and I tried my best not to fall asleep. It turned out that he was a French national living in St. Martin to help rebuild the school and other damaged public buildings. Local civil engineers were overwhelmed by the scale of the projects needed, and his Paris firm sent him here to help the locals. When asked about his family, he replied that he was a bachelor. No wife, no children. I bought the first beer, and when I came back from the pub, Jean-Paul was lying on his stomach and looking at me with a smirk on his face. Half an hour later, Jean-Paul offered to buy a second portion and left. While he was gone, I tried to engage Jane in a conversation that had nothing to do with our interlocutor. Just as I was asking Jane about dinner, Jean-Paul came back with our beer. Jane turned to Jean-Paul. "We were just discussing dinner. Maybe you can recommend a place? Our favorite restaurant closed after Irma." Let me take you to my new favorite place in Marigot. This will be my treat. I couldn't hide my annoyance, but Jane replied before I declined his offer. That's very nice of you. Can we pick you up on the way? That's how we ended our Friday night with the Frenchman. Dinner was good, but I could have done without Jean-Paul's condescending attitude. Like many Frenchmen, he seemed to have a certain dislike for the Americans, especially our military. More than once, he made snide remarks about the bad decisions made by the United States. I bit my tongue before agreeing with him. I wanted to say that we made a particularly bad decision when we drove the Nazis out of France together with the British. But I held my tongue because he could use my words to get Jane's sympathy. It wasn't my first rodeo. Jane had a good evening being the center of attention. Maybe I should have been more worried about her flirtatious manner, but we're talking about Jane. This is a woman who has done the right things all her life, has been a good daughter and wife. We took turns dancing with Jane. From time to time, I caught Jean-Paul trying to rub up against Jane, and whenever that happened, I intervened. It really pissed him off. When I finally told Jane it was time to leave, he tried to tease me with a snide comment. I would have left him there, but he came out with us, and I decided to take him home. When I stopped in front of his apartment, he tried to tease me again by kissing Jane. I'm sure she thought it was going to be one of those cheek kisses, but he kissed her on the lips, catching Jane off guard. I was glad she didn't return the kiss. We made love that night, but we used those damn condoms. I missed feeling her. I decided to avoid this jerk for the rest of the weekend. I hinted that I didn't like this guy, that he was rude and disrespectful. Jane didn't argue, and I thought I'd made my point. When it came time to board the plane, I tried my best to tell Jane that I loved her and to be careful. During the first week, we talked on the phone almost every evening. She called me on Saturday afternoon, informed me that the staff was spending the evening at dinner, and promised to call me on Sunday. When we finally connected on Sunday evening, Jane looked distant. She claimed that she was just tired from a long week because she had been working for the first 6 days. Over the next 2 weeks, the calls became less and less frequent. By the end of the third week, I got worried and planned to fly in next weekend. We had a good long conversation on Thursday. I told Jane about my plans to fly in on Friday and stay until Sunday. But I didn't tell her that my flight home was actually on Tuesday, and it was her birthday on Monday, and I wanted to surprise her. Jane greeted me at the airport with kisses and hugs. She said I was in for a pleasant surprise. She's booked a bungalow in Phillipsburg. She said she was tired of living on the French side and wanted a change of scenery. It seemed strange, but I was determined to use this weekend to rebuild my relationship with my wife, and my whining about her plans would not help me start the weekend right. The first hint of trouble came when Jane undressed that night. The light was weak, but I didn't see any tan lines. That night we made love, of course, with condoms, but it was too dark to know for sure. I did the smart thing. I didn't sleep until she fell asleep, and I used the flashlight on my phone. Damn, there's no trace, not even a thong. The next morning, the weekend went downhill. When I asked Jane about the lack of tan lines, she became defensive and came up with some story about being able to sunbathe in privacy on their terrace, adding, "You don't trust me?" I was already starting to distrust, but I kept it to myself. It is difficult to determine the right approach in this situation. In retrospect, I should have grabbed Jane and brought her home. If she had cheated, maybe I would have forgiven her and we could have solved the problem with counseling. Some couples can survive a husband or wife cheating, but it takes two to save a marriage, and at this stage, I'd be working alone. On Saturday and Sunday, we went about our business until I faked my departure from the island on Sunday afternoon. Initially, I intended to catch Jane at her apartment on Monday morning and spend as much time with her as her work schedule would allow. At least, I assumed that we would have breakfast and dinner together. Now, after such a lousy weekend, I've reconsidered my plans. We said goodbye at the hotel. Jane to return to her apartment in Marigot, I to go to the airport. The depth of our relationship is evidenced by the fact that Jane did not argue when I suggested that she not accompany me to the airport. She was probably in a hurry because she didn't notice that I asked my taxi to turn around at the first roundabout and follow her taxi. She drove straight to the apartment where we met Jean-Paul that first evening, more than a month ago. She didn't even knock on the door, but walked right in. I paid the driver and thought about what I should do. It took only 2 minutes to decide to meet them, but I hoped I wasn't too late yet. I was about to knock on the door when I heard the words that destroyed all hope. They probably wouldn't have heard my knock, given the banging on the door and Jane's screams. I left and went to the airport, missing the Sunday flight, but managed to change my ticket from Tuesday to Monday. I checked into the room and got drunk. I don't think I slept more than 2 hours. I can't say why, but for some reason I got out of bed early on Monday morning. I bought a bouquet of flowers and took a taxi to Jane's apartment. I gave $20 to a young man to take flowers and a postcard I bought earlier to her door. When he knocked, I was watching him from across the street. Allison opened the door, took the postcard, disappeared into the apartment, then handed the postcard back to the young man. He came back to me with flowers and a postcard. The lady said that your wife no longer lives there, wrote a new address on the postcard. Sorry. He handed me a postcard, and I saw Jean-Paul's address written on it. Do you want to get another 20? We can walk a quarter of a mile and get them there. Of course. We walked without saying a word. I think the young man was embarrassed for me, a married cuckold. He knocked on Jean-Paul's door. I stayed in the park opposite, but I saw a young man pass a postcard and flowers through the open door. When the young man returned, he only said, I don't think she's yours anymore. I'm sorry. Neither of them even bothered to put anything on before opening the door. I gave him the 20, and before we could leave, the apartment door opened. Jean-Paul came out, still naked, and threw flowers over the railing. That same day, I flew home and began to unravel our married life. On the advice of a divorce lawyer, I documented the balances in our accounts, divided the funds, and opened my own accounts, deleting my name from our shared credit card and checking account. My goal was to get everything ready before I informed Jane of our divorce. If Jane noticed the lack of love and warmth during subsequent, infrequent phone calls, she didn't say anything until the 3rd week. For some reason, Jane decided to come home, but she didn't tell me why on the phone. Richard, you don't seem too happy about my return. What happened? Jane, you've been gone for almost 8 weeks. The separation turned out to be more difficult than I expected. You'll see, everything will change when you get off the plane. Let's wait until Saturday, and then we'll talk. Jane seemed displeased with my indifference. Was she really that delusional? I had no plans to meet Jane's flight home. I had no desire to look at her anymore, listen to her excuses, or ask her for reasons. Besides, what if her reasons for why get in your head? My heart was made of stone, and I had another difficult task ahead of me. On Friday evening, I went to Rosa and Paul's house. They welcomed me as their son, as they always have. Richard, what a pleasant surprise. We didn't expect to see you until Sunday. We are looking forward to meeting Jane and having Sunday dinner together. Rose, Paul, I'm really sorry to tell you this. Jane has a lover in St. Martin. As far as I can tell, she was seeing him most of the time she was away. This can't be happening. It's not our Jane. There must be some mistake. There is no mistake. I was convinced of this the last time I was there. She moved out of her apartment and lives with a Frenchman she met there. Rose started crying. The floor looked like it was going to explode. I still don't believe in it. It's some kind of mistake. Well, you can ask her when she arrives tomorrow. You'll have to meet her flight. I'm done with her. There are divorce papers in this envelope. She can ask her lawyer to contact mine. His business card is inside. If she insists, I can send her an official notification, but I don't see the need for that. Everything we own is divided in half. The lease of our apartment expires in 6 weeks, and the rent is paid in advance. This will give her time to extend the contract or take out her property. I threw the envelope on the sofa, turned around and left. Of course, the next day there were calls and text messages. Jane left messages begging me to talk to her. I replied to messages only with my own. Go to my lawyer. It's over with us. Jane Davis. The first time I saw Jean-Paul running towards us on the beach, something happened to me. How else to explain all the stupid things that I did from that moment until the moment I got off the plane at Kennedy Airport? Richard was the man I planned to love all my life, with whom I hoped to start a family, who treated me with love and respect. I repaid him with cruelty and disrespect. It all started from the moment Richard and I stopped at the beach that first day. Jean-Paul was handsome, with the body of a Greek god, only darker. He was charming, but I didn't notice that his charm was directed exclusively at me, and I also didn't recognize his light jokes about Richard. I foolishly blurted out that Richard and I were planning to spend the afternoon on the nudist part of the beach. Therefore, it is not surprising that Jean-Paul appeared that day, and I was pleased to think that I had attracted the attention of such a handsome man. He made sure I was watching him when he got up to take off his shorts. Jean-Paul smiled at me as he sat down on the chaise long to my left and continued to dominate the conversation, and I let him. I've always been a good girl. At school and college, I took my studies and football seriously, rarely attended parties, and the few parties I attended were the ones my parents would approve of if they saw me. I was a virgin until my sophomore year of college, losing my virginity to a guy I dated for almost the entire year. I was heartbroken when we broke up. It wasn't until my senior year that the second guy dragged me into his bed. We only lasted a few months before I realized that I didn't love him, would never love him, and would only hurt him by delaying the inevitable. It was 6 months after graduation when Richard came into my life. I was so happy when he continued our chaste shipboard romance. The expression shipboard romance is casual or ephemeral, as if taking place on board a ship, by knocking on my parents' door. Both my parents fell in love with Richard. Dad always referred to him as his son. Richard was the perfect gentleman when we were dating, never pressured me in terms of bed, allowing me to take my time to realize that he was my future partner before we made love for the first time. And it was love. I will never forget his look when he loomed over me and entered me. That look said, "I love you." The following week, Richard proposed to me, of course, with my father's permission. It was a short engagement, a wonderful wedding, and a honeymoon, just like in a Hallmark movie, until Richard took off his swimming trunks and I took off my top on a public beach. Our marriage was just as wonderful, and we were months away from starting a family when I messed it up. The reasons why I volunteered to help build the clinic were mostly altruistic, but not entirely. 2 middle-aged nurses at work poured poison into my head, telling me how I missed out on a lot because I was a good girl and didn't experience all the joys of life before settling down. How could you get married so early? Have you ever wondered what it would be like to make love to a real stud? These 2 snakes filled my head with doubts, and I was too stupid to realize that they were single, divorced, and jealous of my happiness. So, I took the opportunity to take a few months away from my life to make sure that pregnancy at 28 was really what I wanted. Jean-Paul invited us to have dinner with him in the city as a thank you for allowing him to spend the afternoon with us. Richard didn't want to agree, but I agreed without consulting him. At that moment, Richard would have looked stupid if he had refused. We picked up Jean-Paul at his apartment, had dinner in the city, and walked through the block to the dance club. It was almost a competition to see who would turn me on the most. It was almost midnight when Richard finally said it was time to return to our room. Jean-Paul made a comment about Richard being a loser at the party. Richard replied, "No, it's just time for me to be alone with my wife so that we can end the evening the way a happy married couple should." I think it made Jean-Paul angry. He seemed to take it as a challenge. When he got out of the car at his house, he kissed me on the lips. Jean-Paul tried to use his tongue. Fortunately, I kept my lips closed. I think the only reason Richard and I didn't fight that night was because Richard saw that I didn't return the kiss. The next morning, Saturday, Richard told me that we would not go to the beach, and we went to the Dutch side of the island and had a good lunch. That night we stayed at home and made love. Richard was leaving on Sunday, and it was nice to spend the last night in his arms before we parted. On Sunday, I kissed Richard goodbye when he drove me to Allison's apartment. His last words before getting into the rental car were, "Remember how much I love you, how much I will miss you. Be careful, my love." In the first week, Jean-Paul showed up at work to say hello and invite me to lunch. We had lunch together, and he dispelled my suspicions by behaving like an impeccable gentleman. When Allison warned me that day to be careful around Jean-Paul, I brushed off her concerns. "Well, just be careful around Jean. Paul, don't forget that you're married to a wonderful man." That was probably the worst thing she could have said at that moment in my life. On the first Saturday, the entire staff went to dinner. Jean-Paul must have become friends with one of my colleagues, because he showed up and sat down at our table, charming everyone except Allison. Jean-Paul persuaded me to return to the same dance club where Richard and I spent the evening. Jean-Paul danced with me for the next 2 hours, practically making love on the dance floor, taking breaks only to have another drink at our table. He took liberties with me, which I never allowed Richard to do in public. and he took me to his apartment and used me. There is no other way to describe it. Jean-Paul used my body, and my body responded to him. That night, I never had time to think about my betrayal. Every time my conscience began to torment me, Jean-Paul read my thoughts. After the first time we made love, we lay together, I in his arms. Just when I was about to say, "I have to go," he turned me over on my stomach and took me from behind. "Bon, beautiful, you're awake." We finished and took a shower together, not stopping playing with each other until the warm water ran out. Jean-Paul made coffee and sliced a baguette for breakfast. He lent me a toothbrush. I wasn't surprised to see that he had a supply of cheap toothbrushes in his drawer. When he saw my expression, he just gave me his wicked smile. "Hurry up, we're going to the beach. I'm going to have to stop by and grab a swimsuit." How am I going to explain last night to Allison? "You don't have to, you're not going home." "Do you have a bikini collection in another drawer?" "No, but you can wear one of my shirts until we get to the beach. You won't need a swimsuit on a nude beach." "But I never go without underwear, even if it's a thong." "Today, everything will change." We actually went to a nudist beach, though not on Orient. We went to Kapikoi, the beach that Richard and I had already visited once. Jean-Paul seemed to take pleasure in making me feel uncomfortable by pushing the boundaries. It was the first time I refused him. He was unhappy, but resigned. I let him put sunscreen on me, and it was almost a mistake. I felt like I was getting wet again. "Let's get back to you." We did so, and made love 2 more times before Jean-Paul brought me to my apartment in the evening. And again, Allison said something wrong. "I thought I told you to be careful with this man. He's going to ruin your life and ruin your marriage." I didn't need a moral lesson. I didn't say a word. I just went into my bedroom and closed the door. For the next 2 weeks, I was rushing back and forth between my apartment and Jean-Paul's apartment. And all this time, Allison was cold to me at work. Finally, on Thursday, I had enough. Jean-Paul asked me to move in with him earlier that week, and so far I've been hesitant. "Allison, Glenna is looking for a place to live. Why don't I move out and give her my room, do you mind?" Allison breathed a sigh of relief. "That's fine with me." "When?" "Tomorrow." I spent the evening packing my things and talking to Richard on the phone. His voice sounded lonely, and it was a difficult phone conversation. I couldn't tell if he suspected anything, but I tried to calm him down. We even agreed that he would come to us for another long weekend. "Richard will check the flights and contact me." Now I had to figure out how to keep Richard away from Marigot, my job, and Allison. The weekend Richard came to was a disaster. Richard tried too hard, and I didn't try at all. As a result, I began to feel sorry for him, which led to my disrespect for him. I was almost relieved when Richard suggested that I not go to the airport to say goodbye. My stomach was churning all weekend as I tried to hide the betrayal of our marriage. I hailed a taxi and went straight to the apartment I now shared with Jean-Paul. When I entered the apartment, Jean-Paul was already waiting for me. We only made love 3 times. Okay, this fool belongs to me. That weekend, the way I treated Richard, the way I disrespected him, denying him full control of my mind and body, all because Jean-Paul demanded it, led to the complete destruction of any self-respect I still had. Sunday night was the first time I let Jean-Paul, or any other man for that matter, play with my ass. On Monday morning, a postcard and flowers arrived from Richard. At first I panicked, thinking that Richard knew that I was living with Jean-Paul, but on the envelope I found Allison's handwriting, which forwarded the postcard from my old apartment to the new one. Jean-Paul defiantly threw the flowers outside and then laughed after reading Richard's romantic birthday card before throwing it in the trash. "Wait, you'll see what I bought you for your birthday." There is nothing more useless than a bouquet of flowers. On Saturday evening we went to a club. Jean-Paul was constantly buying drinks. We were dancing. At some point, his friend appeared and joined us. Simon was a thin Frenchman who worked in the planning department. I had already met him once when I had lunch with Jean-Paul. Simon asked me to dance. Come on, have fun," Jean-Paul replied when I looked at him. Simon and I were dancing the first dance. When the second song started, Jean-Paul joined us on the dance floor. They held me between them, danced dirty, twerked, rubbed against me. Finally, one of the bouncers came over to separate us. We must have been acting very risky, because I saw terribly obscene behavior on this dance floor. Jean-Paul got angry when the bouncer told us to cool off. Let's get out of here. When we walked back to the apartment, Simon was still hanging around. He took a joint out of his pocket, lit it, and passed it around. I took a little puff. It was the first time for me. As the joint was passed from one to the other, my head was spinning more and more with each small puff. By the time we got to our apartment, the joint was finished. Jean-Paul poured us tequila glasses as soon as we walked through the door. Jean-Paul and I were sitting on the couch. Simon was sitting at the kitchen table. Simon pulled away without saying a word. Jean-Paul continued to kiss me until he lifted me from his lap. Jean-Paul directed me to the bed. Turn around and sit on it. I didn't understand at first. When I hesitated, Jean-Paul grabbed my arms and pushed me back onto the bed. Jean-Paul didn't give me time to get used to this intrusion. He pressed down on my shoulders so that my back was on Simon's chest. Then he came down on top of me. Nothing prepared me for how long they would use me. I was exhausted and lying between them. I think I cried when I passed out from drinking. When I woke up on Sunday morning, Simon was gone. Jean-Paul made coffee and brought me a cup. It's very rare for him to serve me in bed. It was fun last night. Have some coffee. We're going to the beach. On the Tuesday of the third week after Richard's visit, I felt strange in the morning and realized that I had missed my period a few weeks ago. I snuck into the clinic's lab while the technician was at lunch and took a test on my own, which confirmed that I was pregnant. But how? At the time of conception, Richard was using condoms, and Jean-Paul was protected. Condoms can break, but then a terrible thought occurred to me. On Wednesday, I became convinced that Jean-Paul was using me before I left for work. I put a sample of his fluid under the microscope as soon as I arrived at the clinic. Jean-Paul's little swimmers swam in the sample. This fool was lying. He was fertile and, most likely, the father of my child. I ran down the street to his office and bumped into him. I'm pregnant. So what? It's yours. You haven't been operated on. I've checked, and you're fertile. So what? Get rid of it. Or better yet, take him and let Richard raise him. I can't ask Richard to raise your child. Don't you take care of me and our baby? Shouting these words, I lashed out at Jean-Paul, punching his chest with my fists. Jean-Paul responded by slapping me hard across the face, hard enough to throw me back into a chair. You stupid American fool. Did you really think that I cared about you? It gave me pleasure to make a cuckold out of your handsome sailor husband. Now you can go back to America, and he can raise my child like a real cuckold. Get your shit out of my apartment and leave me alone. The slap and his words were like a cold shower. Suddenly, everything became clear. My life had turned into a cesspool of immorality. The blinders fell off my eyes, and I saw what I had become. Am I too late to save my happy life at home? I reached the apartment and packed my things. At the clinic, I asked Joan if I could stay with her for a few days. I informed him that I was going home. Rumors about this spread within a few hours. Allison came up to me. Well, did he corrupt you? What? Did he sell you to one of the city officials? I warned you to stay away from him. He uses women as bribes to get preferences for his projects. Why didn't you tell me about it? I warned you, but you didn't want to listen. You were too caught up in your dirty affair to listen. Now you're just a cheap cheater. Good luck getting Richard back. I'm sure he knows what you've been doing here. But Richard loves me. I flew home on Saturday, wishing, hoping, and praying that Richard would forgive me so that we could rebuild our lives and love together. I was sure I could get him back. He really loved me. Richard. About 3 weeks after Jane returned home, her mother and father visited me. It was a gloomy meeting. Rosa and Paul were surprised by my lack of emotions until I stopped holding them back. It was right after Rose asked me, "Can't you two do something to stay together? You were so good for each other." I started to choke, but managed to utter these words. That's what I thought too, that we were right for each other. But I heard them making love less than half an hour after we parted at the hotel. She practically ran into his apartment, and when I went to the door to meet them face to face, I heard them. I couldn't have been mistaken in what I heard, and I'm not going to live with a woman who can do this to a man she supposedly loves. I'm so sorry. After this meeting, the calls and messages from Jane stopped. The documents were signed. 3 months later, our marriage became history. I didn't turn into a zombie and drink myself into oblivion every night. It helped that I had friends and relatives I could talk to. They mostly listened. With some of them, I talked about my desire to somehow make Jean-Paul pay for seducing my wife. It seemed unfair to me that he could get away with anything. Several of my friends took my revenge fantasies with interest, offering their ideas, but I don't think they took me seriously. My brother realized that this was not just a fantasy and warned me not to do anything that could lead me to a Caribbean prison. Despite the fact that my brother advised me to give up revenge, the memories of the dark smile on Jean-Paul's face will not disappear until I do something. It took planning, but after 2 months, I was ready to implement my plan. In these 2 months, I have radically changed my appearance. Gone were the business haircut and the clean-shaven face. Now I wore a thick beard. And on the day of departure, I shaved my head. I took a page from actor De Niro's textbook and gained 35 pounds, 87 kilograms. Having changed my sunglasses from round ones to aviators, I was completely transformed. I took a train to Miami and took a boat to Puerto Rico. So far, everything was fine. I was in the Caribbean without any official records of my stay here. Now the most difficult thing is to rent a sailboat without a credit card. That's where an old friend and a lot of cash came in handy. I had a backup plan, but I kept my fingers crossed that I wouldn't need it. Tony Alborough and I served together on the USS Shiloh and have been in touch since he returned to his hometown near San Juan. When I knocked on his door, it took him half a minute to recognize me. 10 minutes later, we were finishing our first beer, and Tony understood why I had come. "You're not going to kill him, are you?" "I'm not going to be an accessory to murder, even if that asshole deserves it." I showed Tony the tools of my revenge, and it made him grin. "Well, I can agree to that. So, do you need a boat big enough to take you to St. Martin, but small enough not to attract too much attention to yourself? We'll talk to Hector at the pier tomorrow." Hector was more than willing to lend us one of the sailboats in his care as soon as I showed him the $300 bills. Tony and I set sail early on Tuesday morning. Just before the fishing boats set sail, sailed all day, and by 2 o'clock in the morning anchored off Grand Case Bay. At 4 in the morning, I slipped into the water and swam to shore. After reaching the shore, I jogged 3.5 miles to the park opposite Jean-Paul's apartment and sat down on the same bench where I sat a few months ago when I watched my wife enter this apartment. I decided to take a chance, waiting and watching, hoping that he was a creature of habit. A young woman left the apartment at 8 in the morning, and Jean-Paul left at 8:30. I followed him at a safe distance. He entered the building. I checked the sign on the door. It was his office. I jogged back to the Grand Case, swam to our boat. Tony weighed anchor, and we spent the day sailing around Tintamar Island. In the evening, we went to Friars Bay. Tony didn't even lower the anchor. I went overboard with my tools in a waterproof case, and Tony swam out of the bay. At 7:20 in the morning, I returned to the park, and 35 minutes later, the same woman came out of the apartment. I waited 10 minutes, crossed the street, and knocked on his door. Jean-Paul opened the door with a towel wrapped around his waist. I didn't give him time to say anything before I tasered him. Of course, he didn't have time to recognize me. That was one of the problems. As much as I wanted Jean-Paul to find out who did this to him, I didn't want to go to jail. Maybe someday, after the statute of limitations expires, I'll let him know if it still matters by then. I closed the door behind me. While Jean-Paul was incapacitated, I tied him to a chair, forced him to drink a bottle of water with a sedative, gagged him, and attached the device. Did I mention that I spent 3 summers working at my uncle's ranch during high school? One of the most unpleasant jobs, at least for me, was the annual castration of bulls and horses. One of the ranch hands showed me how to use a good old bandera to castrate cattle. You tie it around your scrotum, leave it for a few hours, and voila, a useless set of shriveled eggs. With any luck, it'll be hours before anyone finds this bastard. By then, the damage will be done definitively. I jogged back to Friars Bay, swam to the boat, and late on Thursday evening, Tony and I sailed back to Fajardo Harbor. By Saturday morning, I was home, shaved and ready to go on a diet. As for Jane's revenge, that's not going to happen for several reasons. First of all, I know that she is suffering. Her parents had lost their son, and she would have to live with the knowledge that it was her fault. Secondly, I know that there is someone else for me, and living well is the best revenge. And someday she'll understand what she's given up on. Our future, our children, and yes, the love we shared for the first 6 years together. And finally, not letting her apologize was probably the most disgusting thing I could have done. That's my revenge, if I'm honest with myself. Jane. I moved in with my parents and started working at the hospital next to their house while my stomach was growing. My parents forced me to go to a therapist, saying that this was a prerequisite if they would allow me to move in with them and help take care of the child. It took no more than 6 sessions with a therapist to analyze where everything went wrong. 2 harpies from my old clinic set the stage for this. I was immature, allowing their ridicule to fuel my narcissism, believing that I deserved and should get more out of life. I was afraid that I would become a mother and be tied hand and foot. Finally, I was ready to fall in love with a charming seducer who offered something forbidden. Therapy explained to me why I did it, helped me understand what I could do in the future if I ever got another chance at love, but it didn't give me what I wanted more than anything in the world: another chance with Richard. Martin was born on September 6th, exactly 1 year after Irma destroyed St. Martin. The epilogue: Jane. Martin turned 7 years old and we, Mom, Dad and I, went with him to the Philadelphia Zoo. We were having a snack at Tiger Terrace when I saw him. Richard was walking past a large cat waterfall with a woman and 2 children. The eldest of them, probably a 4-year-old girl, was walking, and the youngest, perhaps a 2-year-old boy, was sitting on Richard's shoulders and laughing. This woman couldn't be any different from me: 5'3", 160 centimeters, curvaceous, with brown hair and dark eyes. They were in their own little world and didn't notice us when they passed by. I looked at my parents. Mom and Dad were watching them go. Mom looked sad, but it was Dad who shocked me. In my 35 years, I had never seen my father shed a single tear until that day.